vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I will be reading from August 2nd issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The first article was written by Ross Douthart. The Odyssey remade for cultural wars. Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is the blockbuster that launched 1 million takes. The interpretations crowd my social media feed like Agamemnon's assembled ships at Ulis. They keen in my ears like the sirens' seductive voices. Okay, look. I'm just saying people have a lot of opinions about the biggest movie of the year. And for good reason. Because Nolan's film is perfectly calibrated for the contemporary cultural wars. First, because its source material is a story that everybody wants to claim. Woke and anti-woke, masculinist and feminist, film bros and classicists, professional defenders of Western civilization, and it would be revisers and subvisors. Other classics are similarly claimed and counterclaimed, but not everyone wants ownership of the Iliad, too male, Jane Austen, too female, the Greek tragedies, too depressing, the New Testament, too Christian, or the plays of Shakespeare, too hard to follow the dialogue. But in life, as in Homer's epic, everyone wants a piece of Odysseus. Then, having plucked its ripest fruit, Nolan proceeded to serve it in the blandest form. Gone is the sex and sensuality, but warring deities, the hero's outsized ego and charisma. In their place is a story that's very American, with troops familiar from war, movies, and westerns, dialogue that belongs in a contemporary YA novel, and a moralism that once extremely didactic and extremely general. Civilization collapses when you violate Zeus' law is a teaching of Nolan's story. And while you can imagine the Zeus law is some arcane instruction requiring the castration of a black heifer on the highest peak in the darkest night, it turns out to be just the golden rule applied to house guests, dogs, and Trojans. This is a critique, but is also key to the film's cultural cachet. If you just want to like The Odyssey, if you just want to have a good time at the movie, the bland version still has all the good stuff. The Trojan horse, the Cyclops, a bloody homecoming stitched together by a director with a gift for propulsion and spectacle. If you have a great enough story, you can reduce the spice level and still satisfy the millions of customers with the meal. Then, if you want to claim The Odyssey for your own worldview, to insist that the dominant movie of the summer is speaking directly to your concerns, the banal detactism of Nolan's script is unusually amendable to personalized interpretations. I can give you a plausible reading of the movie in which portrayal of the Bronze Age collapse is an allegory for the crisis of the liberal international order. Nolan, the multicultural liberal, lamenting the cruelty of Trumpism, or a reading in which Odysseus' guilt over the sack of Troy is fundamentally Christian, and the monsters belong to a world that awaits us if Christianity fails. Nolan, the lapsed Catholic, unable to shake his religious upbringing, or for that matter, a proper reading in which Odysseus returns home from a hubristic Middle Eastern war to find guests abusing his hospitality, who knew to be cleared out, Nolan the British Birkin offering an allegory of Europe unable to cope with immigration. I assume the first reading is closest to the directorial intentions, but the material is thin and therefore supple, ready to be shaped by ideological desire. Finally, if you want to critique and hate the movie, and under algorithmically driving condition, haters are hype artists too. Same rule applies. The banality can be interpreted for maximal dislike. Part of the fun of the Odyssey Wars is seeing what happens in kinds of different ways, with an original anti-woke critique of the movie, fixated on colorblind casting, giving way to left-tilting academic takedowns, and then bespoke right-wing critiques riding in the wake. 4,000 plus words from the best-selling translator Emily Watson in the London Review of the Books of a movie she dismisses as entertaining way to hide from the high temperatures for a few hours. Then the pseudonymous online reactionary Bronze Age pervert responding with 6,000 odd words on a movie he calls underserving a serious intellectual, ideological, or aesthetic review. And here I am doing much the same thing, accusing Nolan of banality and then devoting all my column inches to his cultural achievements. So let's give the man his due. He grasped that was the moment demanded was an adaptation of one of Western civilization's fundamental texts, reworked around the widely shared assumption that Western civilization might be finished or foredoomed, in a style that allowed everyone, fans and haters, to blame whatever crimes or curse of group of malactors, including Hollywood directors, they hold responsible for the doom already. His reward will be $1 billion in a box office, a blank check for next time, and the absolute power to determine what we all be arguing about in the summer of 2029. Next article was written by Tom Freeman. He's one of my favorites, but they're all my favorites. Mamdani was wrong to threaten Netanyahu. I don't know what kind of New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani will turn out to be, but he's already proved to be a real disappointment as a statesman. New York is the only city in the world in which at least 750,000 Jews and Muslims of peace live side by side. Rather than being a constructive bridge builder between them, Mamdani, the city's first Muslim mayor, has chosen to be a bridge destroyer, using the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as his axe. It is such a waste of a truly charismatic political talent. Consider Mamdani's recent stunt, threatening to arrest Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel when he visits New York City for the United Nations gathering in September. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu in 2024, alleging he committed crimes against humanity in Gaza. Though Mamdani eventually acknowledged the city had no such legal authority, and instead called on the federal government to execute the warrant days before the Israel leaders visit to Washington, it was just the kind of thing Netanyahu will use in his campaign to get reelected on October 27th. I can write the campaign commercials myself. The only safe place for Jews is Israel. Just look at what's going on in New York. The only leader who can protect Israel's is me, Bibi. In my view, Mamdani and Netanyahu's extreme views are just flip sides of the same coin. Bibi does not recognize the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. In their national homeland, it believes only Israel should govern the territory stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. But the Palestinians are a people, more than 7 million of them to live in that space, and they are not going away or relinquishing their right to statehood, no matter what fantasy Bibi and his followers propagate to the contrary. What Bibi is really selling is forever war between Israelis and Palestinians. Today he lets settlers in the West Bank rip up the villas of Palestinians, and when they resist, his government calls it terrorism. Mamdani does not call for a two-state solution either. He argues that the Jews are not entitled to self-determination in a state of their own, a Jewish state in their biblical homeland in the same region stretching from the Med Sea to the Jordan River. But more than 7 million Jews also live in that space, and they too are not going away or relinquishing their right to a Jewish state, no matter what Mamdani and other democratic socialists say. So they are also effectively promoting a forever war. To be clear, I have no problem with Mamdani's office to highlight the terrible deeds Netanyahu perpetrated in Gaza. I have been denouncing Netanyahu's leadership since he first elected in 1996. I've also denounced Hamas leadership. I would simply ask Mamdani what I ask of every leader. Do you want to make a point, or do you want to make a difference? What if Mamdani actually wanted to be a bridge between Israel and Palestine, a role for which he has unique capacity and talent? If he did, he would declare his intention on the day Netanyahu arrives in New York for the UN General Assembly. He would convene a seminar in his office and invite Israel, Palestinians, Arab, Muslims, and Jewish experts to discuss the city just and stable solution, how to forge two separate states for two people living in that area between the river and the sea. He would invite Saudi representatives to discuss the Arab Peace Initiative, which was launched in this column in 2002 by the Saudi Crown Prince Abdullah bin Abdul Aziz Al Saud. He would invite Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and George Bush to each talk about their respective plans for two states for two peoples. He'd invite Palestinian leaders like Salam Fayyad, former Palestinian Authority Prime Minister who did so much in his tenure to build Palestine institutions for a Palestinian state next to Israel, to discuss how they would revive that effort today. Most importantly, he would invite representatives of Jewish, Arab organizations trying to forge two states for two people, like the Abraham institutions, not to be confused with the Abraham Accords. This is an organization in Israel that works on reconciliation between Palestinian and Jewish citizens of Israel. I have donated money to the group. He would have representatives of Echo Peace Middle East, an Israeli-Palestinian Jordan organization dedicated to driving reconciliation through shared environmental projects. I've also donated money to it. And he'd invite the New Israel Party, a place for us all, established ahead of the coming election, with a combined list of Israeli Palestinians and Israel Jews, led by Rula Dahoud and Alon Lee Green. In an essay published in Haaretz, Green explained that the new party is not a Jewish party with a symbolic Arab representation, and not an Arab party with a symbolic Jewish, but a joint Arab-Jewish party. It proposed to build a peace that will bring both an end to the occupation and the establishment of independent Palestinians side by side with the State of Israel. Last, to add a little star power, he would invite the actress, Natalie Portman. I was so impressed by the speech he delivered at a recent online fundraiser, A Place for All of Us. According to a report in Haaretz, Portman emphasized her identity as a Jewish woman and Israeli citizen, noting that her father was born and raised in Israel and that she has deep love, as many of you, for the people of the region, all people of this region, and for the land and for the future. As Portman told the party supporters, you fought for the return of hostages. You stood against the war of annihilation. And for the children of Gaza, you demanded safer streets, more fair wages. The establishment wants to tell us that this is impossible, that true partnership is impossible. They want to minimize what the incredible leaders are doing here and right now, and they're terrified of what this movement represents. That is what constructive leadership sounds like, a place where us all is still pulling far below the threshold to win a seat at the Knesset. But it's also just starting. If you prefer a more hard-headed version of that message, check out the website for Commanders of Israel Security, which comprises nearly 600 retired Israel Army colonels and generals, as well as Mossad, Shin Bet, Eternal Police, and diplomatic corps who are committed to opposing Israel annexation of the West Bank and working towards a two-state solution. Imagine if Mandami, instead of engaging in a useless stunt of publicly mulling the arrest of Netanyahu, convened all these Israelis, Palestinian, Arab, and Americans advocates of two states for two peoples and invite Netanyahu to address them. Let Bibi, they want to say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with Israel, Palestinian, Arab, and American advocates of two states for two peoples. It would at last send the message to Israel's center, right, center, and left voters that the world doesn't hate them, that the mayor of New York City isn't out to get them, and that all the international community wants is for Israel and Palestinians to be constructive partners ready to explore the only realistic alternatives to a forever war. I have no idea if it would help, but I know for sure what Mamdani is doing is just minting voters for Netanyahu among Israelis who think Bibi is their only protector, his hardline stance, their only salvation. If that's what Mamdani now wants to do with his platform, to add more logs to a fire that is raging quite well on its own, it's such a waste of his talent, such a waste of his office, such a waste of his breath, and such a waste of our time. An editorial comment. All the writers on the opinion page are so facile with words. The next article is written by Jamel Bouie. Why do we tolerate Musk racist commentary? Excuse me for just a minute, I have to put a jacket on. It's chilly in here. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. The Turner Diaries is a work of white supremacist group. It purports to the diary of neo-Nazi militant Earl Turner, who was working to overthrow the United States government, or such as the book calls it, the system, through a group called the Organizational. Turner castigates the system for promoting integration, encouraging non-white immigration, and placing Jewish people, Black Americans, and other minorities in positions of authority over whites. Among other atrocities, the novel describes nuclear attacks on predominantly black cities, a holocaust of Jewish Americans, the total ethnic cleansing of California, the subjugation of women, and the day of the rope, a mass public lynching of white people deemed race traitors for their relationship with non-whites. The white power movement in the United States, notes the historian Augusta Del Olmo, in Saving Apartheid. White internationalists at the end of the Cold War looked to white Southern Africa for inspiration as it planned for coming race war. This apocalyptic fantasy of racial conflict in places such as Zimbabwe and South Africa shaped the Turner Diaries. And in turn, the novel, first serialized in the pages of a white nationalist periodical in 1975 and then published as a standalone volume in 1978, became a touchstone for the American and global far right. The Order, a white supremacist terrorist group responsible for 3 killings, including the murder of the Denver talk radio host Alan Berg, took its name from the book, and Timothy McVeigh, who bombed the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma, killing 168 people, carried messages from the book on his person and once sold the book at gun shows. The ideas, the images, and language of the Turner Diaries have long since entered the gestalt of far-right ideology. The book hovers there even when it isn't mentioned. In his manifesto, for example, David Roof, who murdered 9 people at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, frames himself as a martyr, calls on white Americans to fight a race war against black people. Today, you don't have to look far or dig deep to see the ambient influence of the Turner Diaries and the far right. You need just to spend a little time in the online world for the richest man on the planet, Elon Musk. Although, to be clear, there is no direct evidence that Musk has read the book. The Musk of the mainstream media is an enthusiastic, if awkward, technologist, industrialist, and would-be government reformer, as seen in his now defunct Department of Government Efficiency. But Musk spends much of his time on X, his social media website, where he amplifies his far-right accounts and shares his own white nationalist, anti-immigrant politics for all the world to see. Over the past month in particular, he has adapted the imagery of a recent film, Citizen Vigilante, in which the actor Armie Hammer spends runtime playing a Charles Bronson-esque character who targets alleged criminals framed mostly as Arab and African migrants. Musk uses that imagery to state his views about what must be done to save Western civilization. Yes, replied Musk in an image of gun-toting Hammer clad in black, with the caption, "First the trailers and the invaders." He also shared a post from a different user who explained the point of Citizen Vigilante, in which Hammer character spends the first half of the movie murdering white people, not migrants, is that you must always hang a traitor before you hang an enemy. Musk repeated this several times, including in a post that simply said traitors before invaders. Last month, Musk again posted, "Must deal with traitors before invaders," and then said a few days later that anyone opposing re-immigration is a traitor. Re-immigration is the call from the far-right European political parties to forcibly remove non-white citizens to their supposed countries of origin, regardless of whether they are immigrants or native-born. It is essentially a form of ethnic cleansing and is envisioned as a response to the supposed great replacement of white Europeans with non-whites. As Musk sees it, opponents of re-immigration are traitors to the West, and as traitors, their proper fate, according to the logic of the post, is to be killed as punishment for their role in the demographic transformation of majority white nations, and presumably as a warning to those who might pollute the international bloodstream by welcoming non-whites into their lives and into their family. Musk's preoccupation with demographic traitors flows directly from his obsession with population collapse, which he frames in terms of shrinking European and white American birth rates. White people are a rapidly diminishing minority of the global population. Musk wrote in September 2025. Low birth rate, he later said, is the number one threat to the West, followed closely by migration. There will be no West if this continues. One might even see the discretion of the United States Agency for International Development, responsible so far for an estimated 700,000 deaths worldwide. It's content with its concern with failing white birth relative to those in places such as sub-Saharan Africa, where USAID was active. After all, one way to secure a future for Western children is a zero-sum view of the world, would be to starve African ones. Musk, it should be said, insists that no one has died because of his cuts. In a recent interview with The Economist, Musk denied that he was arrested, even as he defended his far-right views of immigration. If you have a large and rapidly growing group of people whose beliefs are antithetical to Western beliefs, at some point there will be a reckoning, he said. But those views, as we see, are indistinguished from what you would find in the Turner Diaries. With hundreds of millions of followers on a platform he personally controls, Musk stands as the most prominent purveyor of far-right and ultra-nationalistic rhetoric in the world. This is the same Musk who's busy leveraging his vast wealth to shape that some world in his image. And what is that image? As Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff show in their book, Muskism, a guide for the perplexed, an important part of Musk's vision is to see the world as a compound where the horizons of humankind are shrunk into the defense of white fertility. This in turn is tied to the larger effort to liberate humanity from the woke mind virus that Musk sees as a self-destructive tendency responsible for the apathy that has led Western nations to open their society to others. This, too, is little more than a restatement of themes and ideas found in the Turner Diaries, where the titular character believed that whites have been corrupted by a Jewish liberal democratic egalitarian plague. Musk's virulent racism and vicious, disturbing views are no secret. He does not hide them. They sit in plain view, easily accessible on a social media website he owns. If there's a question to ask, then it is this: why does Musk get a pass? Why do politicians, journalists, and commentators treat his far-right racist radicalism as a sideshow rather than the core of his political, ideological, and industrial project, seen in everything from his deep support for Donald Trump in the United States and restore Britain in its decision to construct a massive pollution-generating data center in predominantly black Memphis. Musk spends a large part of his free time fomenting violence and spreading the same hateful ideology that motivated some of the deadliest shootings and attacks ever to happen on American soil. It is the fact that not cars he builds or the rockets he launches that sought to define his place in public life. An editorial comment. We're talking nasty people, Musk, and now we have, it has nothing to do with religion, it has to do with people. Here we have the Pope trying to sell peace and justice and equality, and where we have Musk, who's the totally opposite. This is an opinion written by Messard Boro, is the Dean of College of Arts at Missouri University. What my father's murder taught me about Iran. On December 23, 1978, weeks before revolutionaries toppled the Iranian monarchy, armed assailants carried out 2 coordinated attacks in Azvez, the operational hub of Iran's petroleum industry, killing an Iranian official and American oil executive in separate ambushes. The victims were my late father, Malik Mohammed Bourjerdi, struggling pronouncing that, I'll spell it Bourjerdi, Bourjerdi, and his colleague, Paul Grimm. I read about the attack the next day on the front page of the newspaper. I had arrived in America to study only 4 months before. For most readers, it was another dispatch, a faraway country descending into revolutionary turmoil. For me, was the moment that I learned my dad had been murdered. Some of the men who helped orchestrate the killing later became architects of the Islamic Republic and now sit at the heart of the government that Washington faces in its on-again and off-again war. For decades, American policymakers have viewed the Islamic Republic primarily through the prism of its clerical leadership, yet understanding Iran's resilience and its capacity for defiance requires looking beyond the religious establishment of this late revolutionary generation that helped build the regime. The men who emerged from militant organization will not occupy the commanding heights of the Islamic Republic's power structure. This generation of men was born in the mid-50s, some of the age during the upheaval of the 70s and entered adulthood amid the 1979 revolution. The earlier years leading up to the revolution were a time of clandestine activism and revolutionary struggle. These men built the institutional post-revolutionary order, fought the Iran-Iraq War, and weathered successive waves of domestic unrest, international isolation, economic sanctions, and military confrontations. Whether judgment can make of their record, they are neither political novices nor leaders easily cowed by external pressure. Their longevity has endowed them with a deep institutional memory, a strong instinct for regime survival, and a pragmatic understanding of the uses and limits of both coercion and compromise. As the Trump administration looks to extract itself from the war with Iran, it must grapple with these realities. Neither war nor peace with the Islamic Republic will come easily, regardless of who occupies the White House. My dad was a secular nationalist. He was neither drawn to the religious-inspired revolutionary message of Ayatollah Khomeini nor particularly supportive of Shah Mohammad Pahlavi, whose rule and his views owed much to the CIA-assisted coup in 1953. Despite his misgivings about both camps, he remained committed to his job. When oil workers across the country went on strike to cripple the Shah's government, my dad continued reporting to work in his capacity as a senior official of Oil Service Company of Iran, which supported the national Iranian oil company's petroleum operations. That decision ultimately made him a target. In the weeks before his death, my dad started to receive threats from the militant Islamist guerrilla organization, Mansuram, the victorious ones, which viewed those who continued working in the oil industry as enemies of the revolutionary cause. In the foggy pre-dawn hours of December 1978, just a few feet from our home, the group ambushed my dad as he drove to work, shooting him once in the chest and once in the hand. At the same time, several miles away, members of a closely allied Islamist guerrilla unleashed a haul of gunfire in the car of Mr. Grimm. Both men were killed. The two assassinations were a turning point for Iran. Mr. Grimm, the acting manager of Oil Service Company, was the only American killed during the revolutionary upheaval of 1978 and 79. His murder triggered the evacuation of most foreign personnel employed to Iran's oil, dealing a severe blow to protection. According to figures from the U.S. Department of Energy, within 3 days of the murders, oil would plummet from 3.2 million barrels per day to under 700,000. The economic paralysis of the Shah regime was no longer a looming possibility. It was fast unfolding reality, hastened by a campaign of intimidation and violence waged by Islamist militants. Stunned and disoriented, I returned to Iran to be with my dad. Unlike my father, I had been sympathetic to the revolutionary cause as a teenager. Even I, too, was uneasy with the overtly religious overtones and symbolism. Now the revolution had just claimed my dad's life, leaving me to grapple with grief, anger, sympathy, and uncertainty. The modern world had not yet witnessed a successful theocratic revolution, and what was unfolding before my eyes was bewildering. One day I would visit my dad's grave, the next I would stand among crowds observing revolutionary demonstrations in the streets. Eventually, I left Iran to go back to my studies in the United States. On the flight, I made a promise to myself I would abandon any plan to become a petroleum engineer and would study politics, hoping to better understand the ideas, forces, and events that have profoundly altered the course of my life. I have devoted my academic life to examining the ideological foundations of the 79 Revolution and the architecture of power in the Islamic Republic, and have undertaken what I believe to be the largest empirical study of Iran's political elite to date. As part of this work, I traced the careers of the truculent members of Mansurum, many of whom rose to the highest ranks of the Islamic Republic's military and security establishment. Among the most prominent members was Mohsen Reza, who helped protect Ayatollah Khomeini upon his return to Iran in February 79. In September of 81, Ayatollah Khomeini appointed Mr. Reza, then 27 years old, as the commander-in-chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Mr. Reza went on to become the longest-serving commander of the Guard's history, holding the post for 16 years while overseeing the Corps transformation from a revolutionary militia into a sophisticated military organization with dedicated ground, naval, and aerospace forces. Today, after mounting 4 unsuccessful presidential campaigns, Mr. Reza serves as a senior military advisor to the supreme leader, Mojtaba Khomeini, who fought in the Iran War as a teenager, while Mr. Reza was a top commander of the Guard. Other alumni of Mansurum, who helped oversee my dad's death and other extrajudicial killings before the revolution, rose to the highest ranks of the Iranian military. Among them was Ali Shamkhani, who served as a minister of the Guards and the Minister of Defense, and for decades as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council. He was a top security advisor to Ayatollah Khomeini before being killed in the U.S.-Israeli bombing this past February, targeting the Supreme Leader's compound. Another was Mohammad Bagher Solgar, who served first as the chief of the Guard's Joint Staff and subsequently as a deputy commander and chief of the organization. In March, Brigadier General Zolkar was appointed Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, placing him at the center of Iran's national security decision-making. Both the United States and the United Nations have imposed sanctions on him. General Zolkar has denounced President Trump as a deluded American president who threatened all Iranians. Other Mansourian veterans also wanted to play important roles in the projection of Iranian influence, including helping to establish Shiite military organizations in Iraq and Lebanon, serving as military attaché in Syria, and occupying some of the highest offices of the Islamic Republic, requiring first vice president and active president. For nearly half a century, I have spoken rarely about what happened to my family. The story was too personal, too painful, and for many years too dangerous for members of my family to tell. It also meant withholding parts of that history from my own children while they were growing up. But recently, as Washington found itself negotiating directly or indirectly with men such as Mohsen Rezaei and Mohammed Bak Zolkar, I changed my mind. To most Americans, these names are little more than items on briefing papers. To me, they belong to a revolutionary generation that has not only shaped my own life since I was 16, but whom I understand better, perhaps, than most. The death of Ayatollah Khomeini, one of the Middle East's longest-serving autocrats, together with demands of war against two formidable adversaries, has produced a new political reality. Revolutionary Guard turned policemen have emerged as a country's decisive power brokers. Both the injured supreme leader and the enfeebled clerical establishment understand that their survival and the survival of the Islamic Republic itself depend on the power of the guards. While these military strongmen continue to pay lip service to the Ayatollah, as the supreme leader, they are unlikely to hesitate to shape his agenda, override decisions with conflict with international interest. Such is the perfidious architecture of political authority in post-war Iran. The United States and Israel have yet to learn that the Iranian regime is not made of paper mache, and the Islamic Republic's confrontational ideology is unlikely to dissipate anytime soon. The men in uniform showed no hesitation in killing thousands of their own compatriots in January, a national trauma that Iranian society is yet to fully process. They will continue to practice a politics of performance for domestic audience, even as they recognize that the regime's social contract is both morally bankrupt and fiscally unsustainable. In 1978, members of Mansour gunned down my dad on a road in Aviz. I could never imagine that many of the men who helped oversee the killing or their surviving comrades would nearly half a century become the principal adversaries and interlocutors of my adopted homeland. Like everyone else, I don't know how this war is going to end, but after a lifetime of observing these men, I do know this. Expecting meekness or diplomatic finesse from them is a dangerous illusion. Their combustible mix of vanity and mendacity has trapped Iran in debilitating crisis, both at home and abroad. The accumulation of economic, social, and environmental failures has left the country increasingly vulnerable and made governments even more costly. Yet, the regime endures. The formidable architecture of Iran's deep state, the relative cohesion of its ruling elite, and decades of institutional experience in managing crisis continues to provide it with unremarkable resilience. The result is an uneasy equilibrium. Eternal discontent and extreme pressure intensify, but the state's capacity for survival remains largely intact. This is the paradox of Iran today, a system under relentless strain. It's still far from collapse. Editorial comment. It's rather interesting to read articles from someone who knows what's going on as opposed to what we're reading in newspapers. I guess most of us would not have any comprehension of what this writer was trying to tell us. Another opinion section, Christina Freeland is a former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of Canada. Blaming Canada is no longer a joke. Blaming Canada used to be such a fantastic idea that it was a joke. A couple of decades ago, South Park imagined a campaign against Canada for fabricating an offense, in this case children who swear, as a satirical device whose obvious impossibility was meant to underscore the pathetic human tendency to point fingers at someone, anyone else, for our own failures. Yet here we are, with the actual President of the United States well into his second term, blaming Canada for pretty much everything. The South Park movie culminates in a war between Canada and the United States. For now, in the real world, the battlefield is economic, with Trump threatening to impose tariffs on some $20 billion of Canadian exports, ranging from hockey sticks to cement. The official pretext is unfair Canadian treatment of U.S. booze, dairy, cars. That's just what the most rationale. Earlier, Canada cited crime was being ravaged by the dangerous fires of its own boreal forest. But before that, Canada was considered a national security threat, and therefore subject of tariffs on our steel, aluminum, car parts, cars. But America's trade relationship with its northern neighbors is very strong and mutually beneficial. The Trump White House knows that, because commerce between the two countries is governed by a trade agreement negotiated during the first term administration and lauded by the president himself as the best trade deal ever made. The U.S. runs a slight trade deficit with Canada in overall trade in goods and services, and a large surplus if you exclude energy, which America needs more, not less, of an empire-hungry age of artificial intelligence. At a time when Americans rank inflation and affordability as their top economic concerns, adding another tax on consumer goods, which is what tariffs are, is self-defeating. Rehearsing the economic irrationality of the president's trade war in Canada is fun and a self-soothing behavior for America's long-suffering northern friends. But the reality is that economics of Mr. Trump's tariff attacks on Canada are not really the point. The fight isn't about correcting the global financial imbalance that the president's more high-minded apologists contend the true purpose of his trade policy, nor is it the ending of the Rust Belt deaths of despair, Mr. Trump's most articulate enablers, sometimes cited as a motivation for their protectionism. This doesn't mean that there is no method of what can look like madness. Mr. Trump's tariff offensive has a clear purpose: to demonstrate who was dominant and who must submit. As a U.S. counterpart told me during the USMCA negotiations in 2018, we are 10 times bigger than you, so we should get our way 10 times more than you. The laughable, flimsy, constantly changing justification for the president are, in fact, of that point. True power is being able to do whatever you like, for whatever reason you like to, or for no reason at all. The rest of the world saw that too last month when tariffs were imposed on more than 80 countries on the grounds they were violating forced labor provisions. This from a White House that is friendlier with China than it is with its NATO allies. You don't need to have attended meetings in the Oval Office to have a degree of international relations to see that this is what's going on. The president has been in his usual, utterly transparent self. Since Mr. Trump was elected a second time, he has repeatedly described Canada as the 51st state and our prime minister as a governor. The tariffs would not be levied, he pointed out over and over again, if Canada were to accept absorption. After the new measures were announced, Mr. Trump insisted that Canada was entirely at Washington's mercy. They need us to survive. Without us, there's no way they can survive. In other words, this isn't about wine sales or how Canadian manages forest reviving U.S. manufacturing. It's about whether Canada is prepared to accept a profound change in the relationship with the U.S. It's about whether Canada is willing to go from being an ally and a partner in a relationship governed by treaties and rules to become a vassal, subject to Washington fiat, like the Venezuelan Delcy Rodriguez, only with snowdrifts and hockey. Once you understand that, it is obvious how Canada needs to react, as we did in 2018 when we responded to the first major U.S. tariff attack. With dollar for dollar retaliation, Canada must fight back. The only thing a bully understands is strength. And Mr. Trump is seen to himself as the world's apex predator. Self-defense works best when you do it as a team. And that is why my friend and former Liberal Party leader colleague Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, has struck such a chord around the world with his call for middle powers to act together. That's the right thing for the rest of us to do, and it's happening faster than Americans may realize. But the big unknown remains what happens in the United States. Mr. Trump has made his view plain. His Washington doesn't have allies. It only has satraps, enemies, equals. The latter a singular group that includes China, and some days perhaps Russia. Inside the United States, the pressing question is whether the country will remain a democracy. That matters to the rest of us too, of course. But even if democracy eventually prevails inside the U.S., America's old friends will wonder whether Trumpism permanently reshaped Washington's relationship with the rest of the world. Will a post-Trump America try to rebuild genuine partnership with its like-minded allies based on the idea that win-win outcomes as possible and that even superpowers need to honor their treaty commitments? Or is Mr. Trump saying out loud that most Americans have really thought of their allies all along? The United States is understandably so preoccupied by its internal trauma and its war of choice in the Middle East that it is easy to imagine that these other foreign relationships are second-order questions. After all, in its 250th year, the Republic really is flirting with authoritarianism. But it would be a grave mistake for Americans to treat their place in the world as an afterthought, because the irony is that Washington is abusing its allies at precisely the moment when it most needs them. As the war with Iran is demonstrating, even the U.S. is weaker when it goes it alone. In 1944, when the U.S. began its constructive Pax Americana in earnest and to invest the post-war recovery of its allies, Washington accounted for close to half the world's gross domestic product. Today it's still the single biggest, but its share has fallen just over a quarter. China is roughly 17%, and add NATO partners along with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Team Democracy is back well over half the global economy, accounting for as much as 60%. That's interesting. That's worth reading again, or to paraphrase. In 1944, Washington accounted for half of the world's of the GDP, 50%. And today is down to 40%. Yet a lot of its longtime members, that list of like-minded democracy, doesn't feel much of alliance anymore. A Pew Research last month showed that in most of the 36 surveyed countries, China was viewed more favorably than the U.S. That includes Canada, where 33% of respondents saw American favorably compared with 44% of China. People in France, Germany, and Britain took a similar view. At one level, that's nonsense. China has an authoritarian communist government that imprisons and executes dissents, and ethnic minorities are ruthlessly punishing foreign partners deemed to be stepping out of line, as it did with Canada a few years ago, imprisoning 2 innocent Canadians in response to our decision to honor our extradition treaty with the United States in an unrelated case. But given Mr. Trump's choice to play by China's rules and force smaller countries to suffer to submit, the poll results shouldn't be much of a surprise. Superpowers, even the most benign, are always resented. That means the American allies have long harbored a latent strain of anti-Americanism. Those Pax Americana skeptics are gloating right now, wagging their fingers at the Atlantis and saying they told us so. Would-be future American leaders who recognize the value of allies and think all will be forgiven when the White House has a new occupant and need to appreciate the depth of the damage done by its current resident, they can limit the harm and create the option for the United States to make a different choice in the nature by speaking out. If they don't, the rest of the world will be right to think that all Americans actually agree with the current bully in chief. The only winners from the outcome will be the world's despots. Or, as the great Canadian songwriter and poet Leonard Cohen presently say, you aren't going to like what comes after America. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from Sunday, August the 2nd, issue of the New York Times Opinion Section. We read from the New York Times Opinion Section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader has been Dick Shanley, and thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability,